Please follow along with me. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no more wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does that have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they did. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the wine knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Jackie. What we've been up to this fall is we have been looking at various vignettes, you might say, little episodes in the Gospels where Jesus is sharing a meal with someone. And one of the reasons why we're doing this is because it's such a unique, these meals, these times around a table, as it were, are such a unique little window that you get into who Jesus is and what he cares about and what he came to do. And so we're spending the fall looking at this, talking about this, and trying to answer that bigger question: what does this tell us about Jesus? And in preparation for all of these meals and all this stuff throughout the Gospels, I've been reading a book, just finished reading a book called Unreasonable Hospitality. It is a book. It's an amazing book, great book. It's about a guy that took over this struggling restaurant in New York City and over several years transformed it to becoming named the best restaurant in the world. They had 4 stars from the New York Times. They had 3 Michelin stars, like all of these awards, just awards after word after word. And the story is amazing because he as he tells the story, you begin to realize, and he begins to realize, okay, restaurants that are in the top tier, if you're in the top 50 restaurant in the world, your food's going to be amazing. So how do you stand out? How do you get to be number one? Well, you have to do something beyond just making amazing and incredible food. And so what he said, what we're going to do as a restaurant, as an organization, is we are going to do what he calls unreasonable hospitality. We're going to blow people's minds when they come to our restaurant, not just with the food, but with the service. And here's what he means by that. He tells one story of a family that was on a trip to New York from Spain. It was parents, 2 young kids, and they decided for the last night of their stay in New York City, they were going to go to this restaurant. And they do, and they sit down, they're eating, and eventually the kids start freaking out with excitement because as they're looking at these big giant windows, there's just thick snow dumping on the ground. And apparently, according to the book, they had never seen real snow before in real life. So the owner grabs one of his employees, says, "I want you to go out, I want you to go buy 4 sleds." And then after the meal, this SUV pulls up in front of the restaurant. The restaurant people escort this family to the SUV. They load up in the SUV. They got 4 sleds in the back, and they are escorted to Central Park to go sledding for a few hours. Like, what restaurant does this? Like, Soulfish is not doing this. I've never been greeted with sleds at Young Ave before, but apparently, so they did this. And there's just story after story out like this. Another story was that there was this couple who showed up one night and they were discouraged. They were sad because their flight to the beach for their vacation had been canceled. So their whole week at the beach was kind of ruined. So they're just, let's lick our wounds and go splurge on this fancy pants, dinner. And when the staff of this restaurant finds out that this is what the story is here, they converted their private dining room into a beach that night. They brought in sand and threw sand on the ground. They set up beach chairs that sat low to the ground. They put in a kiddie pool filled with water so that they could put their feet in it. They served them these tropical drinks with the umbrellas in it. And just, you get to have your beach vacation here. And it's just, again, story after story after story like this, so they become the number one restaurant in the world. I did find out they are no longer number one. They're no longer in the top 50. They have fallen from grace. This was like back in 2017-ish. So they've, back in the day, man, that would have been fun to go do that. But I tell you that because here's this company, here's this restaurant that said, we are going to build our whole deal on giving people more than what they expect. We want people, when they have a night with us, we're not just giving them food, we want to surprise them. We want them to experience delightful shock. And I would say, in many ways, that's Jesus' same operating motto as well. If you read through the Gospels, you see how Jesus interacts with people. He's always blowing people's socks off. He's always defying expectations. He's giving people more than they expected. In fact, in this story, we don't just see one shock and surprise. We see three. This story itself is jam-packed with three delightful surprises, and each one of them shows us something really unique about who Jesus is and what he came to do. So what I want to do is just walk through the story and show you each of these surprises and ask the question, what does this show us about Jesus? Sound good? Here's the first surprise. It's maybe the most obvious, but here it is. Jesus turns water into wine. It's a surprise. It maybe not be a surprise to us because if you're familiar with the story, you've heard it before, but this was a shock to them. But here's the setup. In verse 1 and 2, you find out that Jesus and his disciples and his mom are all invited to this wedding in a village called Cana. And you might know this, that in Jesus' cultural moment, weddings were a pretty big deal. It wasn't a little 30-minute ceremony and then, a 2 or 3 hour reception down the street. It was a week-long blowout, big affair. You invited the whole village to come. You brought in the best drink. You brought in the best food. It was such a big deal. We actually there's historical and archaeological records of people suing each other for the wedding reception ending early. Like, that's how much they took. This is how big of a deal this was. They took this so seriously. We will take you to court if your party is lame. And so it was a big deal. And in this story, we have a crisis. In verse 3, it says, when the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. Now, providing the wine for a wedding reception, it would have been the groom's responsibility. And this dummy apparently didn't plan very well, which was, a sign to come of what her marriage was going to look like for her and for many of our sweet wives. But it was he didn't plan well. And like I said, the wine running out wasn't just a party foul. It was a crisis because that means that the party is over. That means it ends. And Mary, Jesus' mom, the concerned mother that she is, she goes to Jesus and she says, hey, red alert. They're out of wine. The party's going to die. And the subtext is, do something. Now, Jesus' response to her, to our ears, sounds a little rude. Sounds like this would be something from Samuel L. Jackson's mouth. But he says, woman, what does this have to do with me? Every New Testament scholar that I read all said the same thing. This sounds rude in our cultural context. This was not rude in Jesus' context. 5 or 6 different scholars that I read said this would be a polite way to address an older woman. In fact, Jesus himself refers to Mary again as woman as they're having a conversation on the cross. He's dying he's on the cross, this moment of supreme grace and mercy, and he refers to her as woman then. He's not being rude. In many ways, what one scholar said, this is like saying ma'am. You might say this is kind of like saying ma'am. However, he is rebuking her here. He says, ma'am, what does this have to do with me? Meaning, my powers are not just, at your whims. I'm not just a genie in a bottle. You don't get to control what I do. But thankfully, for her and for everyone else, he wanted to do something. And so he did. Look at what he did. In verse 6 and 7, Jesus tells the servants to fill up these big stone jars all the way to the brim with water. Big, giant things. Fill them all the way to the top with water. And they do, and then when they go to get water out of it from the bottom, that's the big shock. That's the surprise. It's wine. Water goes to wine. I don't know how to explain it. It's miraculous. It's mysterious. But that's the first big surprise. They think they're going to get water. They get wine, which means the party is back on. Now, what does the surprise tell us about Jesus? Look at the amount of wine that Jesus makes in this story. It says that in verse 6, it says there's 6 stone jars. Each one is about 20 to 30 gallons. So to be generous, that's 180 gallons of liquid. If you convert that into liters, which I did, that will bring you to a grand total of 681 liters. Now picture a 2-liter bottle of Dr. Pepper. That's 341-ish of those. 341 things of Dr. Pepper. If you convert it into milliliters and you go into the wine bottles, how many wine bottles does that create? 908 bottles of wine. Imagine your friends are throwing a dinner party and they invite you over and you show up and you're pulling a U-Haul trailer packed to the brim with cases of wine in it, and they come out and they say, what's all this? And you say, you wanted me to bring some wine. Where do you want it? And they say, we think you may have a problem. That's a lot of booze. So what do we do with this? Because Jesus just made a truckload of booze. And for some of us, likely, that makes us feel a little uncomfortable. And maybe rightly so. I mean, what do you do with the fact that Jesus just made this much real, actual alcohol, not grape juice, as some of our friends have tried to argue before? Anytime I preach on this passage, I always feel compelled to remind people that the Bible says, do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. That is a verse in the Bible. The Bible says drunkenness is a sin. And we can't soften this. We have to wrestle with the fact Jesus just made upwards of 1,000 bottles of wine for this wedding. So what do we do with this? Don't miss the point. One of the points is that wine is always associated in the Bible with joy, with salvation, with flourishing. In fact, when you get images of what the new heavens and the new earth looks like, a world that has been redeemed and restored and has been purged of all evil and suffering, one of the images that it gives us is that there is a river of wine flowing through it. So what is going on here? Jesus, it says in verse 11, this is his first sign. This is his debut into the world as the Messiah. And what does he do? He steps into a lame, dying party, and he blows it back to life with abundant, festive joy. This is Jesus saying, in other words, I am not the buzzkill. I am the party. I am not here to just suck joy. I am here to flood joy. If you think about Jesus, in other words, he's saying, my agenda is not to take the world and turn it into a boring, dry church service. My agenda is to take the world and to fill it so that it is overflowing with celebratory, festive joy. That's why I have come. In fact, I've been thinking for the past few weeks about some of the language that the Bible uses when it describes how God works in the world. Let me share with you just a few of these. This is fascinating. Psalm 13:6, we just sang Psalm 13. If you look at verse 6, here's what it says. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. That word, bountifully, that means overflowingly, beyond my expectations. Here's another one. Ephesians 1, verse 7. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace, which he lavished upon us. Lavished. That's waterfall language. That's saying God doesn't give you a trickle of grace. He gives you an avalanche, a downpour, a flood of grace. I'll give you another one. Psalm 36:8. It says, the children of mankind feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. Bountiful, lavish, abundance. The God of the Bible is not into deprivation. He is into excess. Here's the reality. You and I don't really believe that. Deep down we think God, he is the great buzzkill in the sky, and he wants everyone to be miserable. You know, before I was one of the pastors here at Redeemer, I was in campus ministry, and I saw this narrative play out time and time again, year after year, where students would show up to the university as a freshman, and maybe they came from a church background, or they grew up in the church, and they show up at campus, and they say, okay, I'm here at campus. I kind of want to do the college thing. Like, I want this to be a fun experience for me. And if I follow Jesus here, I'm going to miss out on fun. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shelve Jesus for a few years. I'm going to jump in. I'll get to do the college thing. And then maybe after I graduate, maybe if I get married, have kids, when life already is kind of over at that point and it's boring, then I'll return to Jesus. I'll return to the Jesus thing. Maybe I'll go back to church or something. And what the assumption is that Jesus is the obstacle to the joy. He's getting in the way of the joy. And it's not just college students, it's the rest of us as well, where deep down we think God is barking at us, stop doing the fun stuff that you like doing, start doing the boring stuff that you hate doing. We think that's how God operates. He just wants us to be miserable. And for all of us, this passage is looking at you and me, and thankfully it is shouting in our face, you have no clue who Jesus is. He's not the buzzkill. He's the life of the party. Jesus himself said, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. That blows up all of our expectations. We don't think that's actually true, and yet this story shows us it is. That's the first big, delightful surprise of this story. Let's keep going, though, because there's more. There's another delightful surprise in this story. And we'll get to it once we understand the deal with this master of the feast. Reminds me of the Les Mis song. Master of the feast. You get introduced to him in verse 8. He's like the wedding coordinator. He's like the MC of the event. And once these servants, they draw this wine, they take it over to the master of the feast, and he tastes it, and he's blown away. It's the best wine he's ever tasted in his life. Look at what he says in verse 10. Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. See, the way that it worked back then was that if you wanted to throw a good party, you put out the good stuff first. When people were at their sharpest, their taste buds were the most sensitive. They could taste and appreciate the luxuriousness of the wine. And then as the night goes on or as the week goes on, they care less about the quality of the wine. And that's when you pull back on the good stuff and you bust out the $4 chuck or whatever it is now, as it were. Because, you want to throw a good party, but you don't want to go bankrupt. And yet, so here's this guy, and he's tasting this wine. He's like, okay, we're deep into this party, and you're pulling out the good stuff at the end. This is not low-end, bottom shelf, off-brand, generic garbage. This is amazing, high-end, fancy pants, top shelf stuff. Jesus has made some of the best wine this guy's ever tasted in his life. And so what you learn is that he is blowing up everybody's expectations. You think you do the best at the end, and Jesus says, no, the best, not at the beginning, but at the end. And so that's the surprise. Jesus saves the best for last. But what does this show us about Jesus? Because if you say, okay, Jesus just saves the best for last, great. Here's what's so ironic about this passage. The groom did bring out his best at the beginning. Everyone thought, wait, you're saving the worst for the first and the best for the last. That's not what the groom thought. The groom said, here's the best I got to offer. Jesus' was just so much better. It blew it out of the water. It made it taste like vinegar in comparison. What we learn is that Jesus is better than even our best. There's this fascinating place in Philippians chapter 3. Paul starts listing out all of the best things about him. He lists his resume, his report card, his CV. He just goes through his pedigree. Here's my best. Here's all the great accomplishments that I have done, and here's who I am. And he says, I have learned not to root my well-being and my identity in those things any longer. I have learned to root them in who Jesus is. Jesus is infinitely better than those things. It's not that those are bad things. In fact, do you know the word he uses? He uses the word dung, feces. The Bible gets pretty earthy at times. He says, in comparison, it's not that that stuff is feces, but in comparison, it might as well be because Jesus is so much better. This stuff, is it good? Yes, it's good to be accomplished. It's good to reach your goals. It's good to be a nice, caring, loving person. Yes, good. He's just saying, by comparison, that stuff is so flimsy, it is so frail. Why in the world would I base my identity on it? I have learned to root who I am and who Jesus is for me. If you do the math and you think, okay, what would that actually look like in my life if I understood my very sense of self not based off of what I had and what I did and what people thought of me, but I really rooted it in who Jesus is and how he relates to me. You could say, okay, worst case scenario, I blow my life up, make a huge moral failure. You can just totally destroy your life. You can still know when you are rooted in who Jesus is that you're still okay. In fact, not just that you're okay, but that you are loved and treasured by the King of the universe. Because you're not defined by your failures. In the same way you're not defined by your successes. You have a rock-solid internal security. And even if you do the other scenario, let's say best case scenario, you don't blow up your life, but you just crush it at life. You reach all your goals, you get the promotion, you get recognized, yay, everybody loves you. When you have an identity that's rooted in Jesus, it prevents that from going to your head. You don't go all Kanye and think you're just God's gift to the universe. You realize, okay, even my successes, even my failures, that's not what defines me. What defines me is the love of Jesus. That is rock solid. That doesn't change. That doesn't go away. That's so much better than our best. That's the second thing that we learn with the story, is that Jesus, what he's offering us, it's better than even the best that we could come up with. But there's one more surprise, and it's the best one. It's the best surprise in this whole story. The third surprise is simply this, that the groom gets the credit. Did you notice this? If you look at verse 9, the master of the feast tastes this wine, and he goes over not to Jesus, but he goes over to the bridegroom. And he says to him, verse 10, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But look, you good sir. You have kept the good wine until now. In other words, the groom is getting all the credit for what Jesus did. Here is this guy that is a complete dummy and screwed up the whole party, and yet everyone now thinks that he's a hero. Everyone's celebrating him. Everybody says, I mean, they had to have been talking about this party for years. They would have been saying, dude, you totally had us. We were days deep into that party, and we thought your party was mid, but then it went goated. And you know that that's what they would have said. And this guy set the standard for what a wedding party actually looks like moving forward. Not only does this guy not get shamed into oblivion, not only does he not get sued, he's the hero. And do you know what he did? Nothing. He didn't do anything. In fact, that's not actually true. What he did was cause the problem. He was the screw up that needed the problem to be fixed in the first place. In other words, his contribution to this whole ordeal was not neutral, it was negative. And notice, Jesus doesn't elbow his way into this conversation between the master of the feast and the groom and say, well, just for the record, technically it was me. I'm the one that did it. He doesn't do it. He just says, lets the other guy gets all of the credit for his work. Now, what that tells you about Jesus, that gives you a little window into the very thing that Jesus came to offer in the first place. Jesus came to bring festive abundance, but the way that he came about doing it was through switching places with us. Think about this. Let's say that somebody wants to write a book documenting everything about your life. Everything that you've ever done, everything that you've ever said, everything that you've ever thought, anything that you've ever looked up on the internet, anything that you've ever purchased, anything that you've ever fantasized about, anything that you've ever written in an email or posted online. Let's take your whole life, let's put it into a book and put your name on the cover. And this person in this thought experiment says, let's do that same thing with Jesus. Let's take every thought Jesus ever had, everything he ever did, every miracle, birth to death, how he perfectly loved God, perfectly loved his neighbor, no sin, bind it all together. Here's Jesus' life with his name on the front. Let's take both of these books, let's present them to God, and just see what God thinks about it. Let's just say, God, render a verdict. Give an opinion about these two different lives. And right before, the day before these two books get printed, there's a printing press error, and the covers accidentally get swapped. So here's your life with everything that you've done, but it's all now attributed to Jesus. And here's Jesus' life, everything he's done, and now it gets attributed to you. And so God takes each of these books, and he takes the book that's of your life, and he starts to see every time that Jesus yelled at somebody in traffic, every time Jesus called somebody who voted differently than him crazy or stupid, every time Jesus got drunk, every time Jesus looked at porn, every time Jesus raged at his neighbor or his family member, all the times where Jesus felt so entitled and felt so self-righteous because he happened to have read the Bible that morning, all the times that Jesus looked down his nose on other people, elevated himself other people, just over and over and over and over, and God looks at this life and says, this deserves my condemnation. I'm going to pour out my justice and my condemnation on this life. Whoever did this, string him up on a cross. And then God takes the second book and he looks at every time that you fed the 5,000. Every time that you raised somebody who was dead, every time you fed someone who was hungry, how you always moved towards other people when they were hurting, when they were lonely, you always prioritized other people above yourself. You were willing to humble yourself, make yourself weak and impoverished, always for the benefit of somebody else. And God looks at this life of complete sacrifice and humility and moral beauty and says, well done, good and faithful servant. This person deserves an endless party for the rest of eternity with all of my accolades and all of my glory getting dumped onto this. This is amazing. What the gospel is that, but it's not an accident. That's the original design. that Jesus came to take the blame for your life and for my life. And he came so that you could get all of the credit for his life. So that when you trust in Jesus, that means that God the Father now looks at you and he looks at me and he says, well done, good and faithful servant. I find you morally stunning and beautiful. You have my smile, you have my affection. I'm going to pour an avalanche of glory on you for the rest of eternity. We're going to have a wedding party that's never going to stop. And here you and I are, like the groom in the story, we're the idiots that screwed everything up. And yet we are getting something so lavish and has nothing to do with anything that we have done. It has 100% to do with what he has done for us. What that shows you is that God is infinitely better than we could ever ask or imagine. He is a God of abundant, unparalleled, immeasurable grace for people who don't deserve it, for people who deserve the exact opposite. So here's the question, what do you do with this? How do you apply this into your life? I'll say it's a little bit of a dumb question. No offense. But it's a little bit like saying, okay, it's like you coming home from a really hard day, and let's say it's deeper into the winter, when it's cold and you can't feel your fingers and you can't feel your toes and you just feel gross and you're hot. I mean, you're freezing, not hot, and you're freezing and you're exhausted, and you come home and you turn on a hot shower and you see the steam starting to kind of fill the bathroom, and then you look at the bathroom from across the way, and here you are, you're freezing, you're gross, and you're looking at it and you say, how do I apply this to my life? No one asks that. You just get in. You just jump in and enjoy it and bask in the warmth and in the goodness of it. My invitation for you this morning is to just get in and bask in the beauty and the wonder of God's grace and of his love for you. To really let the waterfall and the avalanche of his love and his grace pour over you, and you begin to realize, okay, he's so much better than I thought he was. He's so much more loving, so much more gracious than I thought he was. The way that you enjoy that is you just get in and you bask in it. Consider that an invitation for you this morning. Let me pray. Oh, Father, thank you that you are infinitely better than we could ever comprehend, than we could even conjure up. Father, I pray that you would help get rid of these deeply buried notions that we have in our souls, that you are miserly, that you are here to take joy and life away from us, and help us to see you as the good and lavish and generous God that you truly are, that you would take prodigals and throw a party for them, that you would take grooms that screw up their lives and can't plan parties well, and you would give them the credit of being a hero, that you would take tax collectors and you would justify them. Father, would you take us with all of our unique struggles and failures and addictions and everything that is so broken and convoluted and dysfunctional about us, and would you help us to truly believe that we are the recipients of your great love? Only you can overwhelm us to that degree, so do so. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.